Hello, everyone. My name is Vladimir. I'm a team leader at Localization studio Riotloc and in near past games localizer, translator and editor. And today we gathered together to talk about writing and localization, how one challenges another. I think I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves first, and then we'll start talking. Fabio?
Okay, so my name is Fabio. I've been working in localization like 15 years after starting my career on video game magazines. And I really enjoy translating games. And when I don't do that, I stream games and I play music with games because I'm a chiptune artist with a Game Boy. So video games, basically.
Okay, Anthony?
Me? No, sorry. Hi.
Yeah,
my name is Anthony Jauneaud. I'm a narrative designer and writer, and I've been working for 10 years now in the industry, mostly in France. And last year we released a game called Nightcall.
Thank you.
Hey, my name is Nat. I'm a translator. I've been in the industry since 2013. I'm a video games translator, Russian English. My favorites are MMORPG games. Well, my first big project was Allods Online, and it's been my favorite ever since.
Thank you. Localization writing, I want to see if we can discuss together how they are connected and how writing is affected by localization and vice versa, because to my experience, any game, just as any movie, any book, localized, translated, is not the same as the original, because something is created by an author in certain cultural environment, in certain historical background, and usually for people from the same background. And then this creation needs to be transformed for people in totally other culture, with people with different mindsets. And I'm interested, sometimes there are things that cannot be directly reflected in other cultures, whether it's linguistic or some sharp social themes, something else. And I'm interested how localizers usually approach such things that cannot be simply translated or cannot be directly explained in their language. We can share maybe a few stories from personal experiences and then see how can we proceed. Yeah. Fabio.
Okay, so I think that in my experience, the best things happen when the translator is able to work directly, or at least with a very close connection to the actual writer. Because there is maybe 80% of a translation, of any translation, that you can do on your own as a translator, because there is nothing ambiguous, and you know exactly what's going on. But there is a 20% where you need an input from the writer, either to understand exactly what's going on, or in case, like often happens with language, you have a very difficult, maybe a pun or something that does not translate exactly into your target language. You need to be able to talk to whoever wrote the text in order to better represent their vision. And so, okay, this is in English. In Italian, this just doesn't work. Let's find something that's akin to your original vision. And in my experience, whenever the developers are willing to actually not only work with the translators, but also to share what's important about their idea of narration, you as a translator can decide on priorities, on a style, and you can then find better questions to ask to the developers. Like recently, we've worked on NeoCab, and there was a very peculiar translation problem, which was there was a non-binary character, and that fact was an important part of the story, or just of the vision of the writers. And they asked us, this character is non-binary, can you please, and the main character respects this and use gender-neutral pronouns, can you use gender-neutral pronouns in Italian? And was like, yeah, there's no such thing. And actually, Italian is a very gendered language. And so we were, usually the grammatical rule we learn when we are in school is that in case of ambiguity in Italian, just default to the male, plural, or just to the male. And that was the default solution. It was just so sad. It was like, this would be a huge betrayal of the vision. And so we had this very complex question, but we had a trick, because the game was set in a kind of near future, and we could imagine at least that in Italian, in that 20 years of future, something like a gender-neutral pronoun is invented and used. And so we tried to come up with a possible solution. And we wrote a very quick paper on the gender nature of Italian language and what our potential solution would have been. And we asked the writers, is this okay with you? Would this work for you? And they said yes. And they just had to implement an extra character in the game, which is the schwa, the upside down E. And it actually worked, because this was a kind of a sci-fi cyberpunk game, and a very big part in when you read or discover something from the future, it's that weird thing that there's something that's taken for granted, but it's never explained to you. So, and you just figure it out, and then it makes sense. And so basically, in my opinion, by working with the developers, we were able to turn what looked like an impossible challenge and turned it into a world building occasion. So it was not an invention of the translators, it was a solution found together with the developers and the writers. So yeah, when my take from this is that whenever developers really think about localization and don't think of it as an afterthought, and actually put some effort to communicate and work with the translators, the results can be so much better and more fulfilling for everybody.
Well, it's curious, because who knows, maybe this localization was the first sign of new era of Italian language, or new era of all other European languages, which are all gendered. You invented new words, so in future maybe they will go and will be used. Okay, generally, what do you think about the writing and localization? Because localizer is, to me, it's another writer, because they take some creation of the writer, and then very few people have power over localizer. They can put any of their emotions or put their thoughts, or they're just generally translate the characters and story through their mindsets, through their understanding of life. It can be very subtle things, but still it happens because it's passes through another human being. What do you think? Where is this border between author and the translation? What should translator or game localizer should allow himself to do, or what should he stop? Can he can they change a bit, like smoothen certain characters, like peculiarities, if they don't feel they will be applied, they will be well accepted in their nation, in their cultural background or not? Anthony, maybe you had some stories from Nightcall. You had lots of characters. Did you have an experience of your localizers? You wrote in French originally, right? Maybe you had any requests from your translators to change a certain character, or to give him another way of thinking, transform him somehow for English audience?
Yeah, we did on several occasions, but the thing is that we when we started working on the project, I begged the programmer to work on the most simple file that we could. So all the text was written in TXT, because the goal was to be able to send the file and not to go through another software or use Excel to translate the text, because in a way it was like a work of literature. I'm not trying to be pretentious here, but the goal was like it was not just a bunch of strings in an Excel file. It was like a real dialogue, like a movie or a book dialogue. So the funny thing is that I was going through the messages that the conversation that I had with the translators. So I wrote the text in French, and then it was translated in English by two American translators, and we were working almost on a weekly basis. So I was writing I was finishing the first, the final draft in French in, let's say, Friday, and then I would send them to them on Tuesday, and then it would be back again by the next Monday. So in a sense, it was not really being translated. It was more like having another writer, like someone else in the room, just going through the text. It was so fresh in my mind that sometimes they would just send me just one sentence, and I knew exactly where it was, and sometimes there was a typo, or there was a mistake on my side, or it was just something that was not clear. Honestly, this is the best experience I ever had in localization, because I was those two translators, they were working alongside me, and so maybe there are some points that were extremely funny. It's funny now. When I'm reading conversations, I'm laughing, but I know that a year ago, 2 years ago, it was more like, what's going on? So we had a lot of cultural references were extremely hard to get if you were not French. Most of the time, I was commenting. I was saying, "Oh yeah, he's a French president from the Third Republic," or is a French author, and sometimes I was completely forgetting about these. So we had a very long talk about. I was making a joke about a French writer, and then we had to change the writer. So it was Romain Gary, who is a French author that actually had a second career with another name. So he had two names at the same time. So we had to change him for Georges Sand, who was a woman writing in the 19th century. So I had to rewrite some text in English because the character was suddenly female, and there was another. I mean, the point was completely different. But that was always. It always makes sense because they were two American translators, and they had like this immediate knowledge of American culture, and they could say, no, it doesn't work. We don't know who that person is.
This is the best case scenario, though, because you actually treated the translators as a part of the writing team, which is the closest relationship you can. Yeah. That really is the best case scenario, and this is how localization can produce a very nice localized text, but also improve with some insight the actual writing process. This is not the case when you work with big companies and there is several steps between the writers and the translator.
Yeah, this is the thing that when I started working in the industry, I started at Ubisoft, so 10 years ago, and I met with the localization team there, and they were extremely tired. And every time they were talking about their projects, they were like, yeah, people send us on Friday evening, like, oh, by the way, we need those 5,000 words for like yesterday. And it's like, no. So I don't know. I think I was extremely lucky to grow up in a country where a lot of stuff was translated for like 30, 40 years. And I grew up watching a lot of Japanese content that was badly or voluntarily mistranslated. So suddenly when the 2000s arrived and I was able to buy the original Japanese content that I watched when I was a kid, that was just like, wow, those characters are different. They are not, they swap genders, they completely change storylines sometimes. They added a lot of jokes that were not in the original show or anime. So when I started working in the industry, my goal was like, I really want to be sure that what I want to write, the stories I want to tell, are actually translated in the best possible way. And I don't have time to write everything in 8 languages, and I know just English. So this is not my role, and I have to trust other people. So I think it makes sense, and it's the best decision I've ever took on Night Call. Is like, I want those people to be beside me, because otherwise I could write the game for a year and then send way too much words. I can't say the scope out loud because it's painful. But if I send let's say 250,000 words, what's going to happen? Like, what am I going to do? I'm just going to wait for them to work on. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And the other thing, and then I'm going to shut up, is that it forced me to actually finish my writing. Because I knew that the chain was there, and I had to finish my writing and send it by Friday. Otherwise, it would take another month, and so on and so on. So it was really nice also to have this very personal deadline. Yeah.
Thank you. Again, my question is. You're talking about good translation, and while you were talking, I was thinking, what is the criteria of a good translation? Because, for example, the example that comes to my mind, we'll have many translations of The Lord of the Rings in Russian, for example, and one of the most famous, like, classical one is a brilliant, very beautiful translation of The Lord of the Rings that sounds absolutely like Russian folklore tale. Like it doesn't sound at all like something written in English by an English writer about their folklore. It has names translated and adapted and they sound like old Russian style folklore names. It has very poetic wordings which are like typical for old tales. So, and it's still controversial translation. There are people who love it, there are people who hate it. And what do you think? Like, what is like, what should a translator do? Do they need to adapt some creation, its style, its characters to something that would be something would be closer to their community, to their culture, or they should be closer to the word, stricter with the original, and convey the original style, even if it will not be always understood in the country. Nada, maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that it really depends on your target audience. It depends on who you're translating it for. The Lord of the Rings, it's a fairy tale because I know that many kids and teenagers love it. And perhaps that's what the translator had in mind when he was, he was translating it. If you translate a book on history, on military history, you don't have to adapt it and make it look like it was written in your language, because you're obviously translating it for someone who understands the source, the origins, you know. Well, perhaps the basic idea here is to understand your target audience and adapt to them and listen to them in the first place, because even within a nationality there are different groups of people, you know. Just you have to know who you're writing for. Mm-hmm.
I have a question for you, because that's quite interesting. In French, The Lord of the Rings is also heavily translated into French, which is kind of weird now when you think about it. But if you had to translate The Lord of the Rings, would you change all the names? Would you make them understandable for Russian?
You know, I have read several translations into Russian, and I liked the best the translation that is heavily adapted to Russian. So I think I just do the same.
I think I would keep the first names because most of the names in the Lord of the Rings have follow some very precise rules in language, and they are tied to some kind of linguistic lore within the book. But I would definitely translate all of the nicknames and such. And I think that I would love to be able to understand Russian in order to understand that version of the Lord of the Rings, because that's a no-no, but that sounds so interesting, and I think it could be an amazingly interesting job if your target language has a strong folklore. The thing is that today, if it's a translation made in 2020, that's a big no-no. But maybe in 1970 or in 1960, without the internet, without many information, that might have been a very understandable choice. But if you do something like that, right, that might not be the best localization solution, but you can do an hell of a job if you do it right. And
I also know that
controversial, of course.
I also know that the Spanish team also goes with full as they can adaptation. They translate all the names, all the locations, and they even want to change the illustrations, the drawings in the book, to look more like, you know, closer to Spanish culture.
Well, then you can go too far, for example, and maybe translate. I don't know. Let's say there's some sailor of Victorian age in the game, and he has very peculiar slang that is typical for this very country and this very age. And if you replace it with the local slang, you just will get another character in the end, just from the way he speaks. So how would you treat, for example, that case if people have very peculiar lexicon that is typical for that very background, and you need to convey somehow their personalities and the way they speak, these peculiarities in the writing?
You don't change this isolated character, you change the whole environment, the whole world of the book. And this very character should fit naturally in the thing you adapt, in everything you adapt.
Yeah, I have a very specific example about this very case. A couple of years ago, we worked on the translation of Return of the Obra Dinn. That was a game set in a very specific time frame, the East India Company, in a very specific setting, which is a sailboat. And so you had language from an old era and a very specific language, the language of the sea, of the sailors. And that was a huge challenge because you can't just use the modern language and you still need to be understandable. So the thing you do is you try to translate it the way it would have been written if it was written back in the day, but in your target language. So what we did was read books about that time, read the Italian translations of books around that time, and then you also have to start doing some kind of research if you want to do a job done right, about the very specific language of that kind of job, so the job of the sailor. And that was really hard. Like, it took me a full week to do the work I usually could have done in an afternoon. But it was so worth it and so hard. And it was very helpful to have a team to bounce your ideas, because sometimes you find a solution, but it's in your head. So you need to bounce the idea to someone else to see, is this understandable? Do you get what I mean here? Is this easy to understand? And of course, it was very important to be able to ask very specific questions to the writer. But you definitely can. You're not just changing, as Nate was saying. You're not just changing a character. You're just you're just setting the tone for the whole story.
Yeah, that's right. And when they say that translators are professional masochists, like the harder it is, then the more they love it.
I have it's not my game, but I think it's interesting because often when they translate Japanese games into French, like people from Osaka, they're usually a bit cantankerous. I mean, like a bit bullish. They have something very different in their speech than other Japanese cities. And one day, I don't know what exactly happened, but they made, I think it was for like a Dynasty Warriors game, but for kids on GameCube, which was called Mystic Heroes, I think. And for some reason, they translated the characters speaking with the Osaka language with a very thick south of France accent, which is very strange because we don't really do accents in French. It's always a bit, it feels always a bit weird. And every time that video I have it somewhere on YouTube, it's just hilarious because that accent is very rare in games. You don't do it, and it's usually, it means that you're dumb. Like it's seen as a dumb accent, which is not the case, but that's how we feel it in French. So that was hilarious, and I think it's probably really hard when you're translating something from a completely different culture because you have to find similarities, and they went for that, and that's I don't know. It's a bit cringy when you think about it.
Yeah, or sometimes you have to make the decision of seeing that similarity and choosing not to communicate that similarity with accent, because that is very weird. It's to me, accents work when you are in a very comical setting, kind of like a cartoonish setting, so you get over that uncanny part. But otherwise, the dialect similarity, there is a very clear-cut case in Italian, because the janitor from The Simpsons that speaks Scottish is in Italian, he speaks Sardinian, which is perfect. But it works like that because it's a cartoon, but it's just it's a random similarity that just happens to work. And that's something magical about that choice. But the thing is that you, every time there is an accent involved, you have to do a creative choice. And as with everything creative, you might do something very wrong, and it's not funny and it doesn't work. So you have to be always very careful with that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I do sometimes use accents on characters, especially if it's a foreign accent, in mobile games where you don't have too much text, where you don't have any descriptions of characters, only their cues, their direct speech. And their strings, their cues are usually very short. So you can't use, you don't have any resources at hand to reveal the character. You just have their direct speech, and then you can use the accent to show that he's he or she is French or German, and thus, give them this peculiar look, this feel.
Make them deeper, more interesting to players.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, I think this might change from language to language, because in Italian we have a series of accents. That's the Russian the Russian accent, the French accent, the English accent, to speak Italian. And while they do have some basis in reality, actors usually exaggerate them. So it's really to use sparingly. I usually like to just translate everything in Italian, which is my target language, and communicate all of the cultural connotations, maybe with a choice of words more than with the accent. Also because as a translator, you're not an actor, and you have no direct control and how that accent will actually play out. So it's always kind of a gamble. So I really like to avoid the accent and try to maybe choose a different word, maybe a weird word, to communicate the fact that the character is a foreigner.
But I think it's interesting because we all Europeans here, and there is a sort of prejudice against accents. Every time we use them in text, it feels weird. Whereas in the States, it's completely fine to have in the same show, in the same scene, same movies, like people from California, New York, Boston. They have very, very different accents, and it's completely fine. And you can show who is someone just by having them say a few words, and it's fine. Whereas, I mean, in French, I would never do it. I mean, it's so weird. Like even on Nightcall, we have 90 characters, no accents ever. Even like the foreigners they speak French. They have some weird grammar stuff, but I can't type accents. It doesn't work. It's
Well,
dirty.
Part of the problem is that accents if a game is dubbed in the US, as you're saying, in the US they actually do have these very separate accents, and it's very natural for them to use them. So when translating, you feel somehow obliged to do that. And I think sometimes it's a mistake because there is lots of Hispanic characters, and the more I've translated Far Cry games with Jamaican characters, and it's a slippery slope. If you start doing accents, where do you stop, and why do you stop? And it can get really cringy really fast.
Always too late, I think.
That's
okay.
why I usually try to avoid at all.
Okay, guys, we are running out of time. I wanted to check a few questions from chat, but I wanted to ask you one more pretty serious maybe question. What do you think about it? Like games now, texts in games now have become more and more serious, and they're not just entertaining. In many cases, they already start to raise some social problems. They can touch religion matters or many sharp topics that can be well evolved in one cultural environment in one country, but still not evolved in another country. What do you think? Should translator take responsibility and transmit all those ideas that are not yet acceptable in their country, and make like direct localization, like trustful localization of that game, and release it in the original way? Or should they smooth in cut the corners, make it more acceptable for their community if they feel it's not yet acceptable? Maybe if the game will just will not get any sales, it will maybe alienate players or something. It can touch their religion, or maybe like homosexuality matters, or some sharp social problems in that particular country. What do you think? What is your responsibility and your choices? Nata? Fabio?
Yes, I'm in a kind of different situation because I translate games from Russian to English, and from my English, games are translated into all European, Asian languages. So my colleagues base their translations on my work. So I just don't have the right to cut any corners. I leave comments for them. I explain things in the comments, but I can't cut anything.
Well, I think to me, I feel a huge responsibility on representing whatever the view of the writer is, and sometimes it happens that it might touch spiky topics, but I don't really think that's your choice, unless it's something very very dangerous that might, but this never happened to me. Unless you say, okay, if you do this, it's going to cause a huge backlash for this and this, but it never happened to me. I think you have just a responsibility to represent the game as a work of art, and so not to cut any corners or even smooth anything. You do have the responsibility, I think, to maybe if you are in close connection with the writer, you may have to say, okay, this is, bear in mind that this concept is a hot topic here. But other than that, it's that is not a translator's job, I think.
Okay.
To say, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, there were different cases. Like I think I'm not sure about now, but like until a few years ago, for example, if you want to publish the game physically in Russia and you have some homosexuality themes, any topics in it, it can be just banned by the government. And I remember I played Magic the Gathering, and there were the cards with the certain characters, and the English version said like there were two characters and they were in love, two male characters, they were in love, and the caption description said like something like their love helped them to pass through many battles and survive and so on. And in Russian it was replaced like their friendship, they were big friends. And I can imagine that maybe the local publishers were afraid that this if they don't smoothen they will have backlash or something, because some countries are less developed in certain topics.
Well, I think I gave you an answer from a privileged position, I do realize now, because I never had that very problem. The most dangerous thing would have been just, okay, this topic might upset some people, but never in my experience it would have been illegal or able to harm the ability of the game to be sold. So I guess this changes from country to country. I was very privileged not ever to have to worry about this. Yeah, but I realized that there are several places in the world where this might be a very common day problem in translation.
Okay. I think we have very few minutes left. Maybe one question. I'll just pick one random question from the chat. Okay, question like this. Would there be a case for not doing localization at all? It could be a good way to learn about other cultures. What do you think about it?
I didn't get a question.
Would there be a case for not? Would it be okay for not doing localization at all? And would it be a good way to learn about other cultures?
I'm sorry, I'm still not understanding the question.
Okay, would you accept?
Maybe you want to jump in?
Would you agree if you don't make localization at all, this would help other people to understand the culture original better, because some essence is lost from the translation.
In a way, yes, and that would work with movies as well. but you would maybe help understand cultures to the higher levels of education that might have access to learning another language confidently enough to understand and enjoy a work of art. And you would just put a paywall between everybody that cannot afford to learn another language or doesn't have the time. So I think the more you localize, the more you can actually spread culture. Of course, reading a book in its original language, it's the best. And so for any game, any movie, but I think you actually help the artist get the message out.
I agree. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I want to say to everyone in the chat who maybe asked questions and I didn't have time to go through them. If you want to ask us something and maybe continue this discussion with the guys, we have Discord channel where everyone is present from this panel. Will be present in the near future. I will share the link in the chat and maybe it will be posted somewhere else in near future. So you could find us there and we can continue talking.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone. Fabio, Anthony, Nata. It was very nice to see you and talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was fun.
It's nice to gather together and talk about what we love. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thanks.
Have a nice evening, day, and afternoon.
Goodbye, everyone.